Most people picture a biblical home as a primitive stone structure, dark, bare, where families slept on the ground beside their animals. The truth is something else entirely. What archaeologists have uncovered in the ruins of cities like Beersheba, Tel Beit Mirsim, and Hazor has revealed a domestic engineering that was sophisticated, functional, and adapted to every detail of climate, faith, and survival. This is the story no one told you about what happened inside those walls. Set the scene in its proper context. Between the 12th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, during the period historians call the Iron Age, the land of Israel was dotted with villages and cities where entire families built their own homes with their own hands. These were not temporary tents. They were not adapted caves. They were structures of stone, clay, and timber, designed with an internal logic so precise that archaeologists can identify a specific floor plan that repeated itself across virtually the entire highland region of Judah and Ephraim. That plan has a technical name, the four-room house. And that plan is the key to understanding everything that happened within those walls. The four-room house did not have exactly four separate rooms in the way you might imagine today. The name refers to a functional division of space. Picture a rectangular floor plan covering roughly 50 to 70 square meters, approximately the size of a two-bedroom apartment in a modern Brazilian city. The space was divided by two rows of stone pillars that created three long corridors running lengthwise, and one wide room at the back that cut across the full width of the house. That back room was the most protected, the most private. It was where the family slept, where they kept their most valuable possessions, and where some households maintained a small domestic altar. The pillars dividing the corridors were not decorative. Each one weighed between 150 and 300 kilograms, the equivalent of 2 to 4 adult men. They bore the load of the second floor or the flat roof, and simultaneously created a visual boundary between the work areas, storage space, and animal quarters. Archaeologists from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem measured pillars found at Tel El Farah standing between 1 meter 60 centimeters and 2 meters 10 centimeters tall. They were hand-cut using bronze tools, and later iron ones, then set directly into a foundation of rough bedrock. Now follow the scene as you step through the door. The entrance was always singular. One door only. This was no accident, it was strategy. In Deuteronomy 6, verses 8 and 9, the Torah commands that the words of God be written on the doorposts of the house. This practice gave rise to the mezuzah, which was already affixed to the right side of the entrance frame. The door itself was made of wood, sycamore or oak, depending on the region, and it pivoted on a stone socket set into the ground. Archaeologists have found these sockets at dozens of sites, worn smooth by decades of daily use. The door stood between 1 meter 50 and 1 meter 70 in height. Most adults had to dip their heads slightly to enter. This was not a design flaw, it was a defensive feature. An attacker forced to bow forward was momentarily vulnerable. Crossing the threshold, you stepped onto a floor of beaten earth, compacted and mixed with lime, and in more prosperous homes covered with a thin layer of plaster. This floor was swept daily, and every 3 or 4 months received a fresh application of a mixture of cow dung and fine clay that functioned as a waterproof sealant. The smell of that fresh mixture was sharp and pungent, but within 2 or 3 days it dried completely and no longer released any odor. In the homes of priestly families or successful merchants, the floor could be paved with polished limestone slabs, smooth to the touch, cool during the summer months. And here comes a detail that completely overturns the image you had. The central corridor, immediately past the entrance, functioned as an interior courtyard. It was partially open to the sky. This means natural light poured into the heart of the house throughout the entire day. That courtyard was the pulse of domestic life. It was where the woman lit the clay oven, the tabu, Every morning, it was where the children played. It was where the family ate their meals when the weather allowed. The tabun was a cone-shaped clay structure, roughly 60 centimeters tall and 40 centimeters in diameter at the base, partially sunk into the ground. It reached temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees, hot enough to bake flatbread in under 3 minutes per side. The bread. Consider what bread meant in that context. An average family of 6 to 8 people consumed between 3 and 5 kilograms of grain per day. This meant that someone, almost always the woman or the eldest daughter, had to grind that grain by hand every morning. The instrument was the hand mill, 2 circular stones stacked on top of each other, each roughly 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter. The upper stone weighed between 8 and 12 kilograms. The woman rotated that stone for 1 to 2 hours without stopping, producing enough flour for the day. The physical toll was brutal. Female skeletons excavated at Tel Beit Mirsim and Lachish show deformations in the knees, wrists, and lumbar spine consistent with this repetitive daily labor sustained over 20 to 30 years. That was the invisible price. Follow the left lateral corridor now. In most excavated houses, this corridor served as the storage area. And here the domestic engineering becomes impressive. Large ceramic storage jars called pithoi, each holding between 40 and 60 liters, stood lined against the wall. An average house held between 8 and 15 of these jars, storing wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, olive oil, and wine. Do the calculation. 15 jars at 50 liters each represent 750 liters of stored food. That was enough to feed a family for 4 to 6 months without depending on any external source. This storage capacity was not luxury. It was survival. A drought, a military siege, a locust plague, any one of these catastrophes could cut off supply for months. The jars were sealed with clay lids fixed in place with beeswax or bitumen. Some were inscribed with their contents and, in certain cases, the owner's name. At Samaria, archaeologists found ostraca, ceramic shards used as labels, bearing records of oil and wine deliveries dated to the 8th century before the Common Era. These fragments reveal a system of domestic inventory management that operated with precision. But there is still the other side to account for. The right lateral corridor in the majority of 4-room houses was reserved for animals. That's right. Goats, sheep, and in some cases a donkey shared the same roof as the family. Before you imagine a scene of chaos, understand the logic. The animals occupied a level slightly lower than the main floor, between 30 and 50 centimeters below. That difference in elevation was intentional. It created a physical barrier that kept the animals from moving freely into the living area, while at the same time allowing the body heat of the animals. A single adult goat radiates heat equivalent to a 150-watt heater running continuously to warm the house during the cold nights of winter in the Judean highlands, when temperatures could drop to 2 or 3 degrees. A single family might keep between 4 and 8 goats and 2 to 4 sheep in that space. The dung was collected daily and had 2 destinations. Fuel for the tabun, dried goat dung burns slowly and steadily, ideal for maintaining temperature, and fertilizer for the adjacent garden or field. Nothing was wasted. Every element of the house was part of a complete cycle of production and consumption that today we would call a circular economy. And then you go up. The staircase was generally set against the outside wall, on the exterior of the house, leading to the second floor or to the roof. It was built from stacked stone forming steps or from timber in regions where the raw material was plentiful. The roof was flat, and that is a crucial piece of information. The flat roof was not an architectural limitation. It was a functional choice that effectively doubled the usable area of the house. In Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, the law required the construction of a parapet around the roof, demonstrating that people spent significant amounts of time up there. The parapet had a minimum height of 1 cubit, approximately 45 centimeters. On the roof, the family spread fruit out to dry in the sun: figs, grapes, dates. The drying process for figs took between 5 and 7 days in summer, when temperatures in regions like the Jordan Valley exceeded 40 degrees. Grapes became raisins in 4 to 6 days. The roof was also used for sleeping on the hot summer nights between May and September, when the interior temperature of the house could remain above 28 degrees, even at midnight. The night breeze on the roof reduced the felt temperature by 5 to 8 degrees. Witness the moment the sun sets and the house changes its entire character. In the darkness, the only source of light was the oil lamp. Each lamp was a small ceramic vessel with a spout where a twisted linen wick sat submerged in olive oil. A single lamp consumed between 20 and 30 milliliters of oil per hour and produced light equivalent to a modern candle, roughly 12 lumens. For reference, a standard household bulb today emits 800 lumens. This means the entire house, with 3 or 4 lamps burning, held a total illumination of less than 50 lumens. It was a permanent half-darkness. The oil burned in those lamps was not the same oil used for cooking. It was the second or third pressing, cloudier, with more sediment, but still functional as fuel. An average family consumed between 3 and 5 liters of oil per month for lighting alone. Over the course of a year, that came to between 36 and 60 liters, a significant quantity that had to be accounted for in the household stores. Darkness shaped the rhythm of life. Meals followed a pattern that biblical and archaeological records allow us to reconstruct with reasonable precision. The first meal came in the morning, just after dawn, and consisted of bread, olives, and when available, goat's cheese. The main meal came in the late afternoon before sunset, and included a stew of lentils or chickpeas cooked in a ceramic pot over the taban, accompanied by bread, fresh herbs such as hyssop and coriander, and occasionally meat. Meat was rare, consumed on average once or twice a month in ordinary households, and almost always goat or sheep. The slaughter followed specific rules laid out in Leviticus 17, verses 10 through 14, and the blood was fully drained before the meat was prepared. Examine the details of the furniture. The word furniture is almost an overstatement for what existed inside a typical Israelite home. There were no tables as you know them. There were no chairs. The family sat on the floor, on woven reed or straw mats, around a shared ceramic or wooden tray. This practice is confirmed across multiple passages. In 2 Kings 4, verses 10 and 11, the Shunammite woman prepares a room for the prophet Elisha containing a bed, a table, a chair, and a lampstand. The text records these items precisely because they were exceptional, not ordinary. This was a room prepared for a guest of honor, not the domestic standard. The bed was also not what you imagine. For most families, sleeping meant laying out straw or wool mats on the floor of the back room. On cold nights, they covered themselves with heavy wool cloaks. Exodus 22, verses 26 and 27, confirms that the cloak was so essential that if taken as a debt pledge, it had to be returned before sunset because it was the only covering for sleep. Only more prosperous families owned a raised wooden frame strung with leather strips or braided cord, the direct ancestor of the platform bed. Then emerges an aspect that transforms the understanding of domestic space entirely: ritual purity. The Judean home was not merely physical shelter, it was a space of daily holiness. The purity laws described in Leviticus 11 through 15 directly affected the internal organization of the house. Ceramic vessels that came into contact with sources of ritual impurity had to be broken, not washed, broken. Leviticus 11 verse 33 establishes this rule explicitly. Stone vessels, on the other hand, did not absorb impurity according to later rabbinic tradition, and were therefore preferred for storing water and preparing food in contexts requiring purity. Archaeologists have found enormous quantities of stone vessels at Jewish sites from the Second Temple period. Cups, bowls and jars carved from white limestone, especially in Jerusalem and the Galilee. Producing these vessels required considerable skill. A single stone cup took between 2 and 4 hours to carve by hand, using iron chisels and sand as an abrasive. The weight of an average stone jar was 5 to 8 kilograms, far heavier than the ceramic equivalent, which would weigh less than 1 kilogram. The solution created a new problem. Maintaining ritual purity in a 50 square meter space shared with animals, children, and all the biological processes of a family was a constant challenge. The mikveh, the ritual immersion bath, was a structure that in larger cities lay outside the home in communal facilities. But on larger rural properties, excavations have revealed domestic mikvayot cut into the bedrock with a minimum capacity of 40 CAs, approximately 750 liters of water. The water had to be living, meaning sourced from rain or a spring, not carried by hand. Stone channeling systems directed rainwater from the roof directly into the mikveh. Calculate the scale of the water system. Water was the most critical and most labor-intensive resource to maintain. Urban homes in cities like Jerusalem, Beersheba and Megiddo had access to cisterns cut into the limestone bedrock beneath the floor of the house. A typical domestic cistern stored between 2,000 and 5,000 liters of rainwater. The rainy season in Israel lasts approximately 5 months, November through March, and the average annual precipitation in the Judean highlands is around 550 millimeters. Every drop of water for the 7 dry months had to be collected and stored within that window. A family of 7 consumed between 70 and 100 liters of water per day for drinking, cooking, washing vessels, and watering the animals. Over 7 months of dry season, approximately 210 days, that represented a need of between 14,700 and 21,000 liters. A single domestic cistern was not sufficient. Families therefore depended also on communal springs, wells, and in planned cities, aqueduct systems. Waterproofing the cistern was a feat of small-scale engineering. The interior rock walls were lined with multiple layers of hydraulic plaster made from burnt lime mixed with ash and ground ceramic fragments. That lining, when properly applied, could last between 15 and 20 years without significant repair. Jeremiah 2, verse 13 uses the image of cracked cisterns as a powerful metaphor, and any listener at the time would have immediately understood the gravity, because a cracked cistern meant lost water and the real risk of dying of thirst. Storing the water was only part of the battle. The heat still had to be defeated. The walls of the 4-room house were between 60 and 80 centimeters thick. The base was limestone or basalt, depending on the local geology, and the upper portion was adobe brick, a mixture of clay, chopped straw and water, molded into rectangular forms and sun-dried for 10 to 14 days. Each brick measured approximately 40 centimeters long, 20 wide and 10 high, and weighed between 8 and 12 kilograms. A single side wall of an average house required between 300 and 500 bricks. The entire house could demand more than 2,000. The thickness of those walls created a remarkable thermal insulation. On the hottest summer days, when the external temperature exceeded 38 degrees in the Jezreel Valley, the interior temperature of the house remained between 24 and 28 degrees, a difference of 10 to 14 degrees. In winter, the process reversed. The walls retained the heat generated by the tabun, the lamps and the body heat of both animals and people, keeping the interior between 10 and 15 degrees, while outside temperatures fell to 3 or 4 degrees. And the records reveal something no one anticipated. Windows were rare and small. When they existed, they measured between 30 and 40 centimeters wide by 20 to 30 centimeters tall, smaller than a sheet of A4 paper. They were positioned in the upper section of the walls near the roof and served more for ventilation than for light. The reason was threefold: security against intruders, protection against the sand-laden wind blowing off the Negev desert, and the preservation of privacy. In Judges 5, verse 28, Sisera's mother gazes through the window waiting for her son to return from battle. The scene only carries its dramatic weight because the window was a narrow opening through which one peered, not a panoramic pane of glass. Follow the construction of the roof, because this is where the home's vulnerability revealed itself. The roof was built with timber beams, generally sycamore, cypress, or cedar in the wealthier homes, laid wall to wall, spaced between 40 and 60 centimeters apart. On top of the beams came interlaced branches, then a thick layer of compacted clay 15 to 20 centimeters deep. The clay had to be rolled flat with a cylindrical stone roller, weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, passed repeatedly over the surface after every rain. This roof was not permanent. With each rainy season, water gradually worked its way into the clay, opening cracks and eventually causing leaks. Proverbs 27, verse 15 compares a quarrelsome woman to a constant drip on a rainy day. The comparison only lands because leaks were an everyday, maddening reality. Maintaining the roof consumed between 3 and 5 days of heavy labor per year, typically at the end of summer, before the first rains of October. The total weight of the roof on the beams was considerable. A covered area of 50 square meters with 20 centimeters of clay represented approximately 10 cubic meters of material at a density of 1,400 kilograms per cubic meter, totaling roughly 14 tons distributed across the beams and walls. That is the equivalent of 3 adult African elephants resting on the structure of the house. The beams needed to be replaced every 15 to 20 years as they began to sag under the load and deteriorate from termites and moisture. And the most brutal labor had not yet even started when you account for the full construction of a house. Excavating the foundation into limestone bedrock, cutting and transporting stone, shaping and drying 2,000 bricks, hewing 300-kilogram pillars, cutting and positioning timber beams, applying and compacting the roof clay. An estimate based on experimental archaeology studies suggests that a 4-room house required between 3,000 and 5,000 hours of labor. With a crew of 5 to 8 men working 10 hours a day, construction took between 2 and 4 months. Most families built during the summer months, between the barley harvest in April and the autumn planting in October. Consider the full domestic scene on any given day. Before dawn, someone lights the Taban with dry dung and kindling. The smoke rises through the central courtyard and escapes through the roof opening. The woman begins grinding grain while the husband leaves for the fields or the workshop. The younger children remain in the courtyard under the supervision of an older daughter or a grandmother. The goats are taken out to graze by one of the sons. The sound of the hand mill turning, a rhythmic, low grinding, audible dozens of meters away, was so deeply associated with domestic life that Jeremiah 25 verse 10 prophesies that the silencing of the millstone and the lamp would be the sign of a community's total destruction. The millstone and the lamp. Life and light. The house was not simply a physical space. Every object within it carried a ritual, economic, and social function simultaneously. The cooking pot was the center of family nutrition. The hand mill was the heaviest and most constant instrument of labor. The lamp was the boundary between human activity and total darkness. The mezuzah on the doorpost was the public declaration of religious identity. The cistern was the guarantee of survival. The storage jars were the insurance against catastrophe. Nothing was decorative. Everything was functional. But the most brutal cost still had not been named when it comes to what women paid. Anthropological studies based on traditional Middle Eastern populations and on osteological evidence from Israeli excavations show that women of reproductive age spent between 10 and 14 hours a day in continuous domestic labor, grinding grain, preparing food, collecting water, carrying a 20-liter jar of water across 300 to 500 meters each way, 3 to 5 trips per day, spinning wool, weaving, caring for children, and maintaining the space. Female life expectancy in these communities was 35 to 40 years, roughly 5 to 8 years less than for men, largely due to cumulative physical deterioration and the risks of childbirth without medical assistance. The bones tell this story with brutal clarity. Female skeletons from the Iron Age II period, between 900 and 586 before the Common Era, found at sites such as Lachish and Tel el-Nasbeh show severe osteoarthritis in the lumbar vertebrae beginning at 25 years of age, knee joint erosion consistent with prolonged kneeling, and extreme dental wear caused by stone particles from the mill contaminating the flour and consequently the bread. Every bite of bread contained grain and rock. Silence. The smell of that house was a universe unto itself. Close your eyes and reconstruct the sensory experience. The aroma of bread baking in the tabun, roasted wheat with a faint thread of smoke, the sharp, sweet smell of wine jars fermenting, the heavy, earthy odor of animals in the side corridor, the soft scent of olive oil burning in the lamps, the cool, mineral freshness of the open cistern, the mild acidity of goat's cheese curing on a stone shelf, and threading through everything, the smell of smoke, always smoke, embedded in the walls, in the clothing, in the hair. Studies of populations that still use the tabun show that daily exposure to biomass smoke causes chronic respiratory illness in up to 60% of women who cook regularly, including chronic bronchitis and a reduction in lung capacity of between 15 and 25% over 10 years. Time shifts. Weeks become months, months become years, and the house ages alongside those who live in it. Adobe walls had to be replastered annually with a fresh layer of clay and lime. Leviticus 14, verses 33 through 45, describes in detail the procedure for dealing with stains on the walls of a house. A text archaeologists interpret as referring to mineral efflorescence, mold, or moisture-induced deterioration. The procedure involves scraping the affected area, replacing compromised stones, and replastering. If the problem persisted, the entire house had to be demolished and its materials discarded outside the city. This was not religious bureaucracy, it was public health codified in ritual language. The social structure inside the house followed a hierarchy that was clear but functional. The patriarch, the AV or father, was the legal and religious authority of the space. In Exodus 12 verses 3 and 4, the instructions for Passover are given by patriarchal household. Each family must have its lamb, and if the family is too small, it must join with the nearest neighbor. This reveals that the house was the fundamental unit of religious organization, not the individual. Domestic worship took place within those walls. Prayers were offered there. Feasts were celebrated there. The transmission of faith from one generation to the next happened not in a distant temple, but in the central courtyard around the tabun, between the smell of bread and the sound of goats. Children learned through imitation and participation. There were no formal schools for the general population until the Second Temple period. A boy joined his father in the field or the workshop from the age of 5 or 6. A girl began assisting with the grinding and food preparation around the same age. By 12 or 13, both were considered functionally adult. The space of the house was the classroom. The work was the curriculum. Examine the details of domestic security. The door was bolted from inside with a horizontal wooden bar set into stone brackets on either side. The key, and yes, there were keys, was made of wood with pegs that aligned with corresponding holes in the locking mechanism. These keys were between 20 and 30 centimeters long and were carried over the shoulder or hung from a belt. Isaiah 22. Verse 22 refers to the key of the house of David as a symbol of authority, confirming that control of the door, and therefore of the house, was a recognized function of power. And there was a space few people imagine, the underground storage chamber. In many excavated houses, archaeologists have found small rooms or silos cut into the bedrock below the floor of the back room. These chambers were between 1 and 2 meters deep and served to store grain at a lower, more consistent temperature, protected from rodents and insects. The underground temperature at a depth of 1.5 meters in the Judean highlands remains between 15 and 18 degrees year-round, ideal for preserving grain. Some of these silos held up to 500 liters, enough to store a family's emergency reserves for 2 to 3 months. No detail was accidental. The arrangement of objects within the house followed a logic that archaeologists call an activity pattern. Artifact distribution analyses from excavated houses show that grinding always occurred at the same point in the central courtyard, identifiable by the concentration of basalt fragments and grain residue in the floor. Cooking took place within 1.5 meters of the tabun, storage clustered in the side corridor. Textile work, spinning and weaving, left its traces in the form of loom weights found in groupings of 8 to 15 pieces, marking the exact position of the vertical loom leaned against the wall. A domestic loom produced enough cloth to make between 2 and 4 cloaks per year, each cloak requiring between 40 and 60 hours of work across spinning, dyeing, and weaving. Textiles were valuable. A quality wool cloak represented weeks of labor and was one of the most important possessions a family held. 2 Kings 4, verse 2, tells of the widow who possesses only a single jar of oil, and that extreme poverty is measured precisely by the absence of every other domestic good. The wealth of a house was not reckoned in architecture, but in the contents of the jars, the quality of the textiles, and the number of animals in the side corridor. Watch the scene on a winter night. The outside temperature has dropped to 4 degrees. Wind comes from the north, carrying moisture. The door is bolted with the wooden bar. The tabun was stoked one final time and now radiates residual heat. 4 lamps are burning, 1 in the courtyard, 1 in the back room, 2 in the storage corridor where the mother organizes the jars for the following day. The goats ruminate in the side corridor, their collective body heat equivalent to a 600-watt heater. The family of 7 settles into the back room on straw mats covered with wool cloaks. The youngest children sleep between their parents to share warmth. The residual smoke from the tabun hangs in the air at a height of 1.5 meters. The floor is cold, the sounds are collective breathing, the slow chewing of the goats, and the faint crackle of the last embers in the oven. This was not poverty. This was life. This house was built by human hands using materials pulled from the earth around it. Every stone was cut, every brick was shaped, every beam was hewn and set in place. The family that slept in that back room lived there across generations, 2, 3, sometimes 4 generations under the same roof, expanding the structure as sons married and needed more space. Archaeologists have documented houses with multiple overlapping construction phases, indicating continuous occupation of 60 to 100 years. They did not know the archaeologists were coming. They did not know that someone would one day excavate the beaten earth floor where their children played. They did not know that the bones of their women would tell the story of the daily bread. They did not know that the fragments of their jars would be catalogued in museums thousands of kilometers away. They did not know that the stone socket on which their door pivoted would be photographed, measured, and published in academic papers read in universities across 4 continents. But they built anyway. They cut the stones. They shaped the bricks. They lit the oven. They ground the grain. They bolted the door, and they lived. The 4-room house disappeared as an architectural form around the 6th century before the Common Era, along with the destruction of the First Temple and the Babylonian exile in 586. When the exiles returned decades later, the cities had been burned, the houses demolished, the cisterns destroyed. The reconstruction brought Persian and later Hellenistic influences that permanently altered the domestic floor plan. But the original model, those 50 square meters divided by stone pillars, with the tabboon at the center and the jars along the wall, was the matrix in which the identity of an entire people was formed. The prayers of the Shema Israel were recited for the first time in those back rooms. The stories of the Exodus were told for the first time around those clay ovens. The laws of Moses were memorized for the first time beneath those clay roofs that leaked in the rain. The faith that has crossed 30 centuries was born not in a palace, not in a grand temple, but in a 4-room house with an earthen floor, a clay roof, and the smell of bread. Everything that endured began there.